The shelter's fluorescent lights hummed with a frequency that had become so familiar it no longer registered as sound. Sarah Mitchell sat on the edge of a narrow cot, her daughter Emma asleep beside her, small hand curled against a rough blanket. Across the aisle, her twin sons, Marcus and David, shared another cot, their breathing steady. Sarah did not move. Any shift might wake Emma, and Emma needed rest. The girl was 7 now, old enough to understand their situation was not normal, but too young to hide the fear that flickered across her face every time someone mentioned home or what came next. The clock read 2:17 in the morning. Sarah had stopped sleeping through nights months ago. Her notebook lay open on her lap, pages filled with numbers that refused to improve. Rent deposits she could not afford. Application fees draining her savings. References she could not provide because her last landlord had evicted them. The spiral had begun gradually. Car breaking down. Missed shifts. Reduced hours. Inability to pay rent. She had fought every step, asked for help, applied for assistance programs with waiting periods that outlasted her ability to wait. And still, the numbers refused to balance. The shelter allowed them 30 days. They were on day 26. After that, 2 weeks sleeping in the car she no longer owned. 2 weeks keeping 3 children fed and safe without walls or locks. Sarah closed the notebook. She refused to cry. Tomorrow she would make more calls, visit more offices, fill out more forms. She would keep moving forward, even when forward looked like a dead end. Around her, the shelter held 32 other people in similar struggles. She had learned that poverty was not a single narrative, but a collection of moments where systems failed and safety nets proved to be made of paper rather than rope. Morning arrived without ceremony. Sarah woke the children gently, helping them dress in clothes worn too often. Emma's shoes were too small now. Another problem for the list. They ate breakfast in the common area. Then Sarah walked them to school. 1.5 miles each way, manageable in good weather, difficult when it rained. The elementary school knew their situation. Emma's teacher pulled Sarah aside that morning. Emma had been quiet lately, withdrawn during group activities. Sarah listened and nodded, already knowing the conversation would circle the same anxieties they all carried. After leaving the school, Sarah walked to the public library, the one place where she could sit without being asked to leave, use a computer without cost. She submitted applications to positions she was qualified for, and some she was not. She checked email for responses that rarely came. She searched rental listings for apartments that might accept a single mother with no current income and an eviction on her record. By noon, she had applied to 14 jobs and contacted 6 landlords. 3 responded immediately demanding first month, last month, security deposit, and proof of income at 3 times the monthly rent. The numbers made her laugh, a short, bitter sound she swallowed. She was passing a community bulletin board when something caught her eye. A flyer announcing a public auction of foreclosed properties. Starting bids as low as $1. The date was Saturday. Among the listings was a lighthouse, described as structurally sound but abandoned. Interior inaccessible due to frozen conditions. Starting bid, $1. Sarah read the listing 3 times. A lighthouse, $1. The listing mentioned the property, included the land surrounding the structure. The thought took root slowly. She could not afford to repair a lighthouse. She did not have resources to make it livable. But if she could claim it, it would be land, a foundation from which she might build something. She spent the evening researching. The lighthouse had been decommissioned decades earlier. The most recent owner had died without heirs, and the property had reverted to the county. Access was difficult, requiring travel along an unmaintained coastal road. Utility connections had been severed years ago. By the time she closed her phone, her mind was made up. She would attend the auction. She would bid her single dollar. If she won, she would figure out what came next the same way she figured out everything else. The days leading up to the auction moved with agonizing slowness. Sarah told no one. Hope was a private thing in the shelter. Saturday morning arrived cold and clear. Sarah woke the children early and explained they would be taking a trip. Getting to the auction required 2 buses and a walk. The municipal building was imposing. Inside, The conference room was filled with people who looked nothing like her. Men in pressed shirts, couples discussing investments. She was the only person there with 3 children, the only one whose coat was held together by safety pins. She found seats near the back. The boys played a simple game on her phone with sound muted. Emma sat pressed against Sarah's side. The auctioneer arrived precisely at 10. She explained the process clearly. Each property would be presented in order. The highest bidder would pay immediately, along with processing fees. All sales were final. Properties went quickly. A vacant lot sold for $800. A condemned house brought in $2,000. When the Lighthouse came up, the room shifted. The auctioneer read the description. Remote location. Structurally sound, but abandoned. No utilities. Difficult access. Starting bid, $1. There was a pause. Then someone in the front row bid $1. Sarah's heart kicked. She raised her hand. $2. A murmur rippled through the room. Heads turned. Someone whispered, homeless. Another bid came, $3. She countered with 4. The bidding continued, each increment small, each one pulling Sarah closer to her limit. At $7, the other bidders hesitated. At $8, they stopped entirely. $8 going once. Silence. Going twice. Sarah held her breath. Sold to bidder number 42. The processing took longer than the bidding. $45 total. Sarah counted out the money. The clerk handed her a deed, a map, instructions, and a liability waiver. As they left, Emma asked, "What do we buy, Mama?" Sarah crouched down. "A lighthouse. It needs work, but it's ours." Emma's expression shifted through confusion to something that might have been hope. "Can we live there?" Sarah paused. "Maybe. We'll have to see." Reality reasserted itself that evening. She studied the map, tracing the location of the lighthouse. It was more than 50 miles from the shelter, accessible only by a coastal road that the map marked as unmaintained. Even if she could reach it, even if the structure was sound, it had no heat, no electricity, no running water. Taking 3 children there in the middle of winter was not reckless. It was dangerous, but the shelter's deadline loomed. 26 days had become 28, then 29. On the 30th day, they would be asked to leave. Sarah had made calls, visited offices, begged for extensions. None had been granted. The system was not designed to bend. It was designed to process, and their processing time had expired. On day 29, Sarah made her decision. She would take the children to the lighthouse. Not because it was safe or wise, but because it was the only option that did not involve sleeping in a car she did not have, or splitting her children up to stay with people who could only offer temporary space. The lighthouse was hers. That had to mean something. She spent that last day gathering what she could. Blankets donated by the shelter. Canned food from the community pantry. A small camping stove someone had left behind. Matches. Candles. A first aid kit. She packed everything into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, creating an inventory of survival rather than comfort. She told the children that night, her voice calm despite the fear coursing through her. They were going on an adventure, she said. They were going to see the lighthouse. It would be hard at first, but they would be together, and they would be okay. Emma looked scared. The boys looked excited. Sarah looked at none of them too closely, afraid her own fear would undermine the false confidence she was projecting. The shelter staff wished them well with expressions that ranged from sympathy to doubt. One caseworker pressed a card into Sarah's hand, a phone number for emergency services. "Just in case," she said. Sarah took it and nodded, already knowing she would not call unless the situation became truly desperate. Asking for help had only ever resulted in forms and waiting lists and the slow dissolution of hope. They left early the next morning, walking to a bus stop that would take them partway to the coast. The journey would require multiple transfers and a final stretch on foot. Sarah had studied the route obsessively, memorizing each connection, each landmark. The map showed that the road to the lighthouse split off from a larger coastal highway, winding through rocky terrain before ending at a small point of land marked only by the lighthouse symbol and the words "private property, no trespassing." The first bus ride passed in relative quiet. The second brought them closer to the coast, the air growing colder and carrying the salt scent of the ocean. Emma fell asleep against Sarah's shoulder. The boys pressed their faces to the window, watching the landscape change from urban sprawl to sparse settlements to stretches of empty land punctuated by rock and wind-bent trees. The final bus dropped them at a crossroads where the pavement ended and gravel began. The driver looked at Sarah with undisguised concern. "You sure about this?" he asked. Sarah nodded. "We'll be fine," she said, the words automatic. He did not look convinced, but he did not argue. The doors closed, and the bus pulled away, leaving them standing at the edge of a road that looked less like a path and more like a suggestion that had been largely ignored. Sarah adjusted the bags on her shoulders and took Emma's hand. "Let's go," she said. They began walking. The road was rough, rutted in places, overgrown in others. Wind pushed against them with steady pressure, carrying the smell of salt and something else, something colder and less forgiving. The children walked without complaint at first, but as the miles accumulated, their steps grew slower. Emma began to cry quietly. Marcus asked when they would get there. David stopped talking altogether, his face set in grim determination. Sarah did not let herself think beyond the next step. She counted distance by landmarks. A fallen tree, a cluster of rocks, a place where the road curved sharply. Each one became a small victory. Each one brought them closer to something that might be shelter or might be another form of abandonment. The lighthouse appeared as they crested a low hill, and Sarah stopped so abruptly that Emma stumbled. It rose from a rocky promontory that jutted into the ocean, its white towers stark against the gray sky. Even from a distance, she could see the damage. Windows broken or missing, paint peeling in long strips. The surrounding structure, a small keeper's house attached to the tower's base, sagged visibly to one side. But it stood, solid and vertical and real. Sarah felt something in her chest release slightly. They walked the final stretch in silence, the children too tired now to ask questions. As they drew closer, more details emerged. The door to the keeper's house hung partway open, its frame warped. The yard, such as it was, consisted of rocks and dead grass and scattered debris. A metal fence, corroded and collapsed in sections, marked boundaries that no longer mattered. Sarah pushed the door open slowly, its hinges grinding in protest. The interior was dim, lit only by failing daylight filtering through broken windows. She stepped inside carefully, testing the floor before allowing the children to follow. The space was larger than she expected, divided into rooms whose purposes were still vaguely identifiable. A kitchen with ancient fixtures, a sitting area with a fireplace, a narrow hallway leading to what might have been bedrooms. Everything was covered in dust and debris, frozen condensation clinging to the walls like translucent skin. The temperature inside was barely different from outside. Sarah exhaled and watched her breath form a cloud. "It's cold, Mama," Emma whispered. Sarah pulled her daughter close. "I know, baby. We'll figure it out." She set down the bags and began to assess. The fireplace was the most obvious source of potential heat. She examined it, noting the chimney still appeared intact. There was wood scattered outside, remnants of what might have once been furniture or structural pieces from years of decay. If she could get a fire started, if the chimney drew properly, they might survive the night. She spent the next hour in focused activity, refusing to let herself think about anything beyond immediate tasks. She cleared a space in the sitting room, sweeping debris into piles with her hands. She tested the floor for stability, finding it solid despite its age. She sent the boys to gather small pieces of wood while she unpacked their supplies, arranging blankets and food and the camping stove with precision that bordered on obsession. When the boys returned, arms full of dry wood, Sarah built a fire carefully, arranging kindling and striking match after match until finally a small flame caught and held. She fed it slowly, watching as it grew, as heat began to radiate into the cold space. The children gathered around it immediately, hands extended, faces brightening slightly in the flickering light. Sarah opened cans of soup and heated them on the camping stove, serving the meal in silence. They ate sitting on blankets near the fire, the warmth creating a small circle of comfort in a space that remained largely hostile. After eating, exhaustion claimed them quickly. Sarah arranged the blankets into makeshift beds, tucking the children close together so their body heat would combine. Emma fell asleep first, her breathing evening out. The boys followed, their whispered conversation fading into sleep. Sarah sat by the fire, feeding it small pieces of wood, watching the flames. She did not let herself feel the full weight of what she had done. Not yet. For now, they were inside. They were together. They had a fire. That was enough. Anything beyond, that was tomorrow's problem. Outside, the ocean moved against the rocks with a sound like steady breathing. The lighthouse stood silent around them, its walls thick and cold and unyielding. Somewhere above, the tower rose into darkness, its beacon long extinguished, its purpose forgotten. Sarah stared into the fire and felt the exhaustion she had been holding back begin to press down on her shoulders. She let it come. She was too tired to fight anymore. Tomorrow she would explore. Tomorrow she would begin the work of making this place survivable. Tonight, she would sit by this fire and keep her children warm and try not to think about how many ways this decision could destroy them all. The fire crackled and settled. Sarah added another piece of wood and watched the flames adjust, finding new paths through the fuel. The light cast shadows that moved across broken walls and dusty floors, revealing nothing and hiding everything. She thought about the people at the auction, their whispers, their judgment. She thought about the caseworker who had handed her the emergency card. She thought about the years that had led to this moment, each choice seeming reasonable at the time, each one contributing to a trajectory she had not anticipated and could not reverse. But beneath the exhaustion and fear, something else stirred. She had done something. She had taken action when inaction would have been easier. She had claimed something when she had nothing left to claim. The lighthouse was broken and cold and possibly dangerous, but it was theirs. The deed in her bag said so, and that had to count for something, even if she did not yet know what. She fed the fire one more time and lay down beside her children, pulling the blankets close. The floor was hard beneath her. The cold pressed in from all sides, held at bay only by the small circle of warmth they had created. Emma stirred slightly, murmuring something indistinct. Sarah smoothed her daughter's hair and closed her eyes. Sleep came slowly, interrupted by cold and discomfort and the constant awareness that they were farther from safety than they had ever been. But when morning came, they would still be here, and that would have to be enough. Morning arrived not with light, but with cold. The fire had died sometime in the night despite Sarah's efforts to bank it properly. She woke to frost patterns on the inside of the broken windows and air so cold it hurt to breathe deeply. Her body ached from sleeping on the floor. Every muscle protested as she pushed herself upright, moving carefully to avoid waking the children who still slept beneath the pile of blankets she had arranged around them. She rebuilt the fire first, her fingers clumsy with cold, striking matches until flame caught in the kindling she had prepared the night before. The wood was damp in places, protesting before finally surrendering to heat. Smoke filled the room briefly before finding its way up the chimney, and Sarah watched it rise with relief. At least the chimney worked. That was one less catastrophic problem to solve. While the fire grew, she explored the keeper's house more thoroughly than she had the previous evening. The kitchen revealed a hand pump at the sink, corroded but possibly functional. She worked the handle, feeling resistance that suggested years of disuse. On the seventh attempt, the pump coughed and spat brown water that smelled of rust and earth. She continued pumping until the water ran clearer, though still far from clean. It would need to be boiled before drinking, but it was water. Another small victory. The cupboards were empty except for dust and the scattered droppings of mice long gone. The walls showed water damage in corners where the roof had failed, dark stains spreading like shadows frozen in time. But the structure itself, the bones of the house, seemed solid. Sarah pressed her hands against walls, testing, feeling for give that would suggest rot or instability. The stone foundation felt cold but firm. The The wooden beams overhead showed age, but not collapse. In what had once been a bedroom, she found remnants of previous occupation. A metal bed frame, its mattress long since removed or destroyed. A wooden chest with a broken lock, empty inside except for yellowed newspaper lining that dated back decades. The window in this room was intact, its glass thick and wavy with age, offering a view of the ocean that stretched gray and endless toward a horizon barely distinguishable from sky. Sarah stood at that window for a long moment, watching waves crash against the rocks below. The sound was constant, rhythmic, almost hypnotic. She tried to imagine living here deliberately, choosing this isolation. The lighthouse keepers who had once maintained this place had done so out of duty or necessity, or perhaps both. They had kept the beacon burning through storms and darkness, offering guidance to ships that could not see their own way forward. There was something almost noble in that, Sarah thought, and something profoundly lonely. The children began to stir as the fire warmed the main room. Emma woke, crying, disoriented and cold. Sarah held her, rubbing warmth back into small limbs, murmuring reassurances that felt thin against the reality of where they were. The boys woke next, their initial excitement from the previous day tempered by hunger and discomfort. They asked for breakfast. Sarah heated oatmeal on the camping stove, mixing it with water from the pump that she had boiled carefully. They ate in silence, the meal providing fuel, if not satisfaction. After breakfast, Sarah made a decision. They needed to understand what they had, what condition the property was truly in. She bundled the children in every layer they owned and led them outside to explore in daylight what they had only glimpsed through exhaustion the evening before. The wind hit them immediately, sharp and relentless, carrying spray from the ocean that left salt on their faces. Emma grabbed Sarah's hand tightly. The boys ranged ahead, their natural curiosity overwhelming caution. The keeper's house formed the base of the structure, attached directly to the lighthouse tower which rose above it, white paint peeling in long strips that revealed older layers of color beneath. The tower's door was locked with a padlock, so corroded it looked like it might crumble if touched. Sarah examined it, noting that the hasp itself was mounted with screws that had rusted nearly flush with the wood. She filed that information away. If she could find tools, she might be able to remove the screws entirely rather than trying to break the lock. The surrounding yard, bounded by the collapsed metal fence, was larger than it had appeared in darkness. It stretched back from the cliff edge, perhaps 50 yards, most of it bare rock with patches of hardy grass and low shrubs that somehow survived the constant wind. Near what had once been a garden plot, Sarah found remnants of a greenhouse, its frame twisted and glass long shattered. Beneath the debris lay soil, protected somewhat from the elements, possibly still usable if she could clear it. Marcus called out from near the cliff edge, his voice high with excitement. Sarah's heart jumped, and she ran, images of him falling flashing through her mind. But when she reached him, he was pointing down, not in danger, but fascinated. Below, partially hidden by the curve of the rock face, a narrow path descended toward the water. Sarah leaned out carefully, one hand gripping Marcus's shoulder. The path looked deliberately cut, switchbacking down the cliff face to a small platform just above the waterline. Storage, perhaps. A way to receive supplies by boat before roads were built. "Can we go down?" Marcus asked. Sarah shook her head. "Not yet. We need to make sure it's safe first." The disappointment on his face was obvious, but he did not argue. She appreciated that. The boys had learned not to push when she said no in that particular tone. They had learned it through experiences none of them should have had to endure. Back at the keeper's house, Sarah began the work of making their shelter more livable. She cleared debris room by room, sweeping with a makeshift broom created from stiff grass tied to a stick. She used old newspaper and rags to stuff gaps around the broken windows, creating crude insulation against the wind. She organized their supplies carefully, creating designated areas for food, water, and the few possessions they had brought with them. The children helped where they could. Emma arranged their clothes in neat piles. The boys hauled wood from the yard, stacking it near the fireplace in quantities that would last through the night. Sarah watched them work and felt a complicated mixture of pride and guilt. They should be playing, learning, being children. Instead, they were helping her survive. That was not fair. But fairness was a luxury they could not afford. By mid-afternoon, hunger drove Sarah to take inventory of their food supplies. 3 days' worth of canned goods, if they ate sparingly. A bag of rice. Some oatmeal. After that, they would need to figure out something else. The nearest town was miles away. She had no car, no bicycle, no easy means of traveling for supplies. Walking was possible, but would take hours each way, hours she could not spend away from the children in this place. She tried not to let panic gain a foothold. One day at a time. That was all she could manage. Tomorrow would present its own problems. Tonight, they had shelter and food and fire. That had to be enough. As the sun began its descent, Sarah discovered something that shifted her attention entirely. She had been exploring the final room she had not yet examined, a small storage space off the kitchen. The walls were lined with empty shelves, their surfaces coated in the same thick dust that covered everything else. But at the back of the room, partially hidden behind a shelf that had pulled away from the wall, she noticed something unusual. A seam in the stone, barely visible, running vertically from floor to ceiling. Sarah approached slowly, curiosity overriding caution. She ran her fingers along the seam, feeling the slight indentation where two sections of wall met. It was too regular to be a crack, too deliberate. She pressed against the stone, feeling for movement. Nothing shifted. She examined the edges of the nearby shelf, wondering if it concealed a door or a hidden compartment. Stories of lighthouse keepers hiding smuggled goods or personal treasures flickered through her mind, romantic notions that probably had no basis in reality. She pulled the shelf completely away from the wall, its old wood protesting with dry creaks. Behind it, the seam became more obvious, and at about shoulder height, she found a small metal plate set flush with the stone, barely larger than her palm. It was tarnished, almost black, but when she rubbed it with her sleeve, brass gleamed beneath the oxidation. The plate bore 3 numbers arranged vertically. No context, no explanation, just numbers deliberately placed and carefully marked. Sarah stared at it, her mind working through possibilities. A date, perhaps. A combination. A code of some kind. The numbers meant nothing to her in any obvious way. She pressed the plate, tried to turn it, attempted to slide it. Nothing moved. Whatever the numbers indicated, it was not immediately clear. She made a mental note of them, committing the sequence to memory. Another mystery in a place full of them. That night, as the children slept and Sarah sat by the fire, she thought about the seam and the numbers. Her practical side warned against hope. Hidden treasures were the stuff of stories, not the reality of abandoned lighthouses sold for $8 at county auctions. But her desperate side, the part that had been on the lighthouse in the first place, whispered different possibilities. What if there was something? What if the previous owners had left something behind, something valuable enough to change their situation? She shook her head, dismissing the thought. Even if there was something hidden, it was probably documents or personal effects, things that mattered to someone once but held no practical value now. She needed to focus on immediate survival. Food, heat, safety, not fantasies about hidden rooms and forgotten treasures. The third day began with a problem Sarah had anticipated but hoped to avoid. The camping stove ran out of fuel. 1 minute it burned blue and steady. The next, the flame guttered and died, leaving them with no way to heat water or cook food beyond the fireplace. Sarah stared at the dead stove, frustration tightening her jaw. She had 1 spare fuel canister, carefully rationed. That would last another few days at most. After that, everything would depend on the fire and her ability to keep it burning constantly. She spent that morning teaching herself to cook over an open flame, balancing a pot on Rock's position in the fireplace, learning through trial and error how to manage heat that was impossible to control precisely. Rice burned, soup boiled over, but by afternoon, she had found a rhythm that worked, and the children ate a hot meal that was only slightly scorched. While they ate, Sarah made a decision. She needed to open the lighthouse tower. Whatever was up there, whatever condition it was in, she needed to know. The tower represented vertical space, possibly multiple rooms, certainly more area than the keeper's house alone offered. If parts of it were intact, it might provide additional shelter or storage. And the process of exploring it would give the children something to focus on besides cold and hunger and fear. After the meal, Sarah examined the corroded padlock again. The screws holding the hasp had rusted through their heads in places. She found a flat rock with a sharp edge and used it to scrape away rust, then wedged it under one screw head and pried. The screw resisted, then suddenly gave way, pulling free of the wood with a sound like tearing fabric. She worked at the remaining screws methodically, her hands growing raw with effort. One by one, they surrendered. When the last screw pulled free, the hasp hung loose, and the door could be opened without ever touching the lock. Sarah pulled the door open slowly, its hinges shrieking. Cold air rushed out, colder than outside, carrying a smell of stone and emptiness. She peered into the darkness, seeing the beginning of a spiral staircase that curved upward and out of sight. The steps were metal, treaded for grip, ascending in a tight helix that made her stomach tighten with vertigo just looking at it. "Stay here," she told the children. Their disappointed protests were immediate and loud. She hesitated, weighing safety against their need for something new, something that felt like exploration rather than mere survival. Finally, she relented. "Okay, but slowly, and hold the railing." They climbed together, Sarah in the lead, testing each step before allowing the children to follow. The spiral was tighter than it appeared from below, the walls pressing close on both sides. Small windows appeared at intervals, offering glimpses of the world outside, each one slightly higher than the last. The children counted steps aloud, their voices echoing in the confined space. 20 steps, 40, 60. Sarah's legs began to burn with effort. The first landing appeared at 83 steps, opening into a small, circular room. Light filtered through narrow windows, illuminating dust that hung thick in the air. The space was empty except for debris that had fallen from above, plaster and fragments of wood. Sarah moved to one window and looked out. The view was staggering. The ocean stretched in all directions, its surface textured with wind and current. She could see the coast curving away to the north and south, miles of rock and water and isolation. "It's so high, Mama," Emma whispered, pressing close. Sarah put an arm around her daughter. "It is. The lighthouse had to be tall so ships could see the light from far away." Marcus wanted to know where the light was. Sarah explained that it had been removed years ago when the lighthouse was decommissioned. He looked disappointed but fascinated, imagining, she suspected, what it must have been like when the beacon burned. They climbed higher. The second landing held what appeared to be old equipment, mechanical components Sarah could not identify, all covered in dust and frozen with rust. The third landing was smaller, almost claustrophobic, with a ladder leading to a hatch in the ceiling. Sarah climbed the ladder alone, pushing at the hatch. It resisted, then gave way suddenly, flooding the space with cold daylight. She emerged onto the gallery, the narrow walkway that circled the top of the tower. Wind hit her with such force, she grabbed the railing immediately, crouching instinctively. The view from here was otherworldly. She was above everything. The keeper's house far below looked like a toy. The ocean extended to a horizon so distant it curved visibly. She felt exposed and vulnerable and strangely exhilarated all at once. Emma's voice called up from below. "Mama, can we come up?" Sarah shook her head, even though they could not see her. "Not today, sweetheart. It's too windy." She remained on the gallery for another minute, gripping the railing, letting herself feel the full scope of where they were. This was not safe. This was not comfortable. But it was theirs. And from this height, the world looked different. Problems seemed smaller. Possibilities seemed larger. When she descended and they made their way back down the spiral stairs, Sarah felt something she had not experienced in months. Not quite hope. Not yet. But maybe the foundation upon which hope might eventually be built. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah returned to the storage room with the strange seam and the numbered plate. She studied it by candlelight, running her fingers along the edges again. looking for mechanisms she might have missed. The numbers stared back at her, offering nothing. She tried pressing them in sequence. Nothing happened. She tried pressing all three simultaneously. Still nothing. Finally, frustrated, she pressed her whole hand flat against the wall beside the plate, leaning her weight into it. The stone shifted. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. But it moved. Sarah froze, heart suddenly pounding. She pressed again, harder this time. The stone section rotated inward slightly, revealing itself not as solid wall, but as a door so perfectly fitted that its edges were nearly invisible. She pushed more firmly, and the door swung open on hinges that moved smoothly despite their age, revealing darkness beyond. Sarah grabbed her candle and held it forward, illuminating a narrow passage that descended steeply into the earth beneath the keeper's house. Stone steps, worn smooth in the centers, disappeared into shadow. Cold air flowed up from below, carrying a smell that was dry and old and strangely clean. Sarah stood at the threshold, every instinct warning her against descending alone at night with 3 sleeping children above. But curiosity burned hotter than caution. She had come this far. She had risked everything. She needed to know what lay beneath her feet, in this hidden space that someone had gone to great effort to conceal. She descended slowly, counting steps, keeping one hand on the wall for balance. At 20 steps, the passage leveled into a corridor. At 30, her candle revealed a door. Heavy wood, banded with metal, secured with a lock that looked far more modern than anything else in the lighthouse. Sarah approached it carefully, reaching out to touch the lock. It was cold but not rusted. Someone had maintained this. Someone had cared about keeping whatever was beyond that door secured and protected. She tried the handle, not expecting it to turn. It did not. The lock was engaged, solid, immovable. Sarah stood there for a long moment, staring at the door, wondering what lay beyond it. Supplies, perhaps. Storage that the previous owners had wanted kept safe from weather and time. Or something else. Something that required a lock that still functioned after years of abandonment. She climbed back up the passage, sealing the hidden door behind her. The stone fit so perfectly that once closed, the seam was almost invisible again. She returned to the main room and laid down beside her children, her mind racing. Sleep did not come easily. She kept seeing that door, kept wondering what it protected, kept thinking about the numbered plate and whether those numbers were part of a combination she did not yet understand how to use. In the darkness, listening to her children breathe and the distant crash of waves, Sarah felt the first true stirring of something dangerous. Hope, not the fragile, desperate hope that had driven her to the auction, but something stronger, something that whispered that their situation might change, that the lighthouse might hold more than she had dared to imagine, that the risk she had taken might lead somewhere beyond mere survival. She did not let herself believe it fully. Not yet, but she could not dismiss it either. The hidden passage existed. The locked door existed. And tomorrow, she would begin the work of understanding what they protected and whether the answers she found might be the difference between endurance and transformation. The morning after discovering the hidden passage brought a shift in Sarah's priorities that she tried to keep hidden from the children. Survival still demanded most of her attention. The endless cycle of gathering wood, maintaining fire, preparing food, keeping 3 small bodies warm and fed. But beneath those necessary tasks, her mind kept returning to the locked door below, the passage, the numbers, the mystery of what someone had thought important enough to secure so carefully. She spent the 4th morning teaching the children how to recognize safe versus unsafe wood for burning. Marcus and David listened with the seriousness of children who understood that mistakes carried consequences. Emma stayed close to Sarah's side, her anxiety manifesting in clingy behavior that Sarah recognized but could not fully address. There was no therapy here, no counseling services, no professional support for a 7-year-old processing trauma. There was only Sarah's patience, which felt increasingly inadequate. While the children played a game with sticks and rocks they had invented themselves, Sarah returned to the storage room. In daylight, with her mind clearer, She examined the numbered plate more carefully. The numbers were not random. She felt certain of that. They meant something to someone. A date seemed most likely. She tried to think like the person who had built this hiding place. What date would matter enough to encode into the entrance? She studied the lighthouse itself for clues, searching for plaques or markers that might indicate when it was built or decommissioned. In the keeper's house, she found fragments of old records, water-damaged pages that crumbled when touched too firmly. Most were illegible, but one fragment showed a date clearly. The lighthouse had been constructed in 1887. She tried that number combination on the plate, pressing each digit in sequence. Nothing happened. Another fragment mentioned decommissioning in 1954. She tried those numbers. Still nothing. Frustration built, but Sarah forced it down. Patience had kept them alive this long. Patience and careful observation. She would not abandon those principles now, even when the temptation to rush forward was nearly overwhelming. That afternoon brought a new problem that drove thoughts of hidden passages temporarily from her mind. Emma developed a fever. It came on quickly. One moment, she was listless but functional. The next, her skin burned with heat Sarah could feel through layers of clothing. Sarah's stomach dropped. Illness here, isolated without transportation or quick access to medical care, was catastrophic. She did what she could. Cool water from the pump, pressed against Emma's forehead. Careful rationing of pain reliever. She kept Emma near the fire, maintaining balance between warmth and overheating. The boys watched with wide eyes. Emma's fever peaked during the night. Sarah did not sleep, monitoring each breath. The emergency card sat in her pocket. She would call if Emma's condition worsened significantly. Until then, she would manage alone. By morning, the fever had broken. Emma woke weak and pale, but cooler. Sarah felt relief so intense it brought tears. This was the razor's edge they lived on. 1 degree higher, 1 day longer, and the outcome might have been different. The near crisis sharpened Sarah's focus. The lighthouse offered shelter, but it was not safe. They needed more than walls and fire. They needed resources, and the only path to those things involved the locked door below. Over the next 3 days, while Emma recovered, she spent every spare moment studying the lighthouse for clues. She examined every surface, every mark. In the tower, she found old logs written in faded ink. The handwriting was precise, methodical. One entry caught her attention. A notation about repairs completed on a specific date, underlined twice. Sarah tried that number combination. The stone door remained sealed. She tried variations. Reverse order. Just the year. Nothing worked. Frustration gave way to exhaustion, which gave way to resigned determination. She would keep trying. On the 7th day at the lighthouse, with food supplies dwindling dangerously low, Sarah made a decision. She would walk to the nearest town for supplies. She prepared the children carefully. David, at 9, was the oldest. She gave him clear instructions. Keep the fire going. Stay inside. Do not let Emma out of sight. If anything felt wrong, go outside and wave at the road. The walk to town took 4 hours. Sarah moved quickly. The road was rough, overgrown, clearly used only rarely. She saw no other people. The isolation was complete. The town was small. Sarah found a general store and bought carefully. Rice, beans, canned vegetables, oatmeal, matches, candles. The clerk watched her with curiosity, but asked no questions. On the walk back, carrying 2 heavy bags, she thought about sustainability. They could not keep living on purchased food. Eventually, the money would run out. She would figure it out through necessity and stubborn refusal to quit. She returned to find the children safe, the fire maintained. The relief was physical. Emma ran to her, arms wrapping tight. That night, with food restocked and the immediate crisis postponed, Sarah descended to the hidden passage again. She had brought a better light this time, a flashlight she had purchased in town. Its beam was stronger, steadier than candlelight, revealing details she had missed before. The walls of the passage were stone, fitted so precisely that mortar was barely visible between blocks. This was not rough construction. It was craftsmanship, the kind that took time and skill and significant resources. At the locked door, She examined every surface, running her hands along the wood and metal, looking for hidden mechanisms or secondary locks. The door itself was thick, solid, built to last. The lock was modern but not new, maybe 30 or 40 years old. Combination-based rather than key-based. She tried the 3 numbers from the plate above, entering them in various orders. The lock did not respond. She tried dates she knew, birthdays of her children, her own birthday. Nothing. The lock remained stubbornly closed. She sat on the stone steps, flashlight resting beside her, and forced herself to think systematically. Whoever had built this had wanted to protect something. They had also left the lighthouse to be sold at auction, which meant either they had died without heirs or they had deliberately chosen not to pass the information directly to family. The auction listing had mentioned the previous owner dying without heirs. That fit. Someone alone, someone who perhaps did not trust that their legacy would go to the right people. The numbers on the plate, they were not random. They were a clue, but perhaps not the combination itself. Maybe they pointed to something else. A page number in a book, a measurement of some kind, coordinates. Sarah's mind spun through possibilities, each one feeling simultaneously plausible and absurd. She was reaching, she knew that, grasping at explanations because she wanted so badly for there to be an answer. She climbed back up to the main house, sealing the passage behind her. Sleep came in fragments that night, interrupted by thoughts that would not settle. When morning arrived, she woke with a new idea. The lighthouse tower. She had explored it briefly, but not thoroughly. Perhaps there were clues there, inscriptions or markings that would make sense of the numbers. It was a thin hope, but hope was a luxury she could not entirely afford to abandon. After breakfast, she climbed the spiral stairs again, this time moving slowly, examining each section carefully. The walls were covered in graffiti, decades of visitors and keepers leaving their marks. Names, dates, crew drawings. Most of it was meaningless. But on the second landing, high up where someone would have needed to reach deliberately, she found something different. 3 numbers, scratched into the stone with precision. They matched the numbers on the plate, but they were arranged differently. Not vertically, but horizontally with small marks between them. Dashes? Or something else? Sarah stared at the markings, her heart rate increasing. This was intentional. This was communication across time, left by someone who knew the passage existed and wanted others to find it. She copied the arrangement exactly in her notebook, studying the spacing, the orientation, the small marks that might or might not be significant. What if the numbers were not a combination, but a map reference? Or a code that needed to be decoded somehow? She spent the rest of that day and most of the next working through possibilities. She tried the numbers as coordinates, though that seemed unlikely given the simplicity. She tried mathematical operations, adding and subtracting and multiplying in various combinations. She tried treating them as letters, converting numbers to alphabet positions. Nothing produced results that felt right. Nothing opened the lock. On the 10th day, at the lighthouse, frustration peaked and Sarah nearly gave up. Nearly. She sat in the main room, watching the children play a game they had invented involving sticks and imagination, and felt the weight of failure pressing down. She had gambled everything on this place. She had brought her children to isolation and cold and danger because she had believed there was no other choice. And now she was stuck here, unable to provide more than bare survival, unable to find whatever secret the lighthouse held, unable to move forward or back. Emma noticed first. She stopped playing and came to sit beside Sarah, small hand taking hers. "Mama, are you sad?" Sarah looked at her daughter's face, seeing concern that no 7-year-old should have to feel for a parent. She squeezed Emma's hand gently. "Just tired, sweetheart." Emma leaned against her. "It's okay to be sad sometimes. You tell us that." The simple wisdom of it, the echo of Sarah's own words, cracked something in her chest. She pulled Emma close. "You're right. Thank you for reminding me." That evening, after the children were asleep, Sarah returned to the passage one more time. She was not ready to give up. Not completely, but she was approaching a point where she would need to make different plans, except that the locked door would remain locked, focus entirely on survival, without the fantasy of hidden resources to sustain her hope. She descended the stairs slowly, her movements automatic now, familiar. At the door, she placed both hands flat against the wood and just stood there, feeling the solid, immovable reality of it. Then, because she had nothing to lose, and because sometimes exhaustion led to clarity, she spoke aloud. I don't know what you're protecting. I don't know why you left this here. But I have 3 children upstairs who need more than I can give them. If there's anything behind this door that could help them, I need to know how to reach it. Her voice sounded strange in the confined space, too loud and too small simultaneously. She felt foolish talking to stone and wood. But foolishness was a small price for the possibility of being heard, even if only by emptiness. She turned to leave, her flashlight sweeping across the door one final time. The beam caught something she had not noticed before. At the very top of the door frame, nearly at the ceiling, there were markings. Small, easy to miss unless the light hit them at exactly the right angle. Sarah stepped closer, craning her neck to see. Letters. 3 letters, carved carefully into the wood. They were initials, she realized. Someone's initials. The lighthouse keeper, perhaps. Or whoever had built this passage. She pulled out her notebook and compared the initials to the numbers on the plate, looking for connections. The letters could correspond to numbers if you assign values based on alphabet position. She did the math quickly. The first letter was the 8th letter of the alphabet. The second was the 14th. The third was the 19th. She wrote them down. 8, 14, 19. Then she tried entering them into the lock, her hands trembling slightly. The lock clicked. Sarah froze. She tried turning the handle. The mechanism resisted briefly, then gave way. The door swung open. The shock of it left her breathless. After days of trying, after countless failed attempts, the solution had been there all along, hidden in plain sight for anyone patient enough or desperate enough to look carefully. She stood at the threshold, flashlight illuminating a space beyond that was larger than she had anticipated. Not a small storage closet. A room. An actual room, carved into the rock beneath the lighthouse. Sarah stepped inside slowly, her light revealing walls lined with shelves, all of them filled. She moved closer, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. The nearest shelf held metal cases, the kind designed to protect contents from moisture and time. She opened one carefully. Inside, wrapped in protective material, were documents. Deeds, certificates, papers that looked official and important, though she could not immediately determine their purpose. She set that case aside and opened another. More documents. And beneath them, something that made her stop breathing entirely. Stacks of bills, bundled and sealed in plastic. Money. Old money, but money nonetheless. She pulled out one bundle and examined it with hands that shook. The bills were real. $100 denominations, dozens of them in each bundle. She set it down carefully and opened another case. More money. And another. And another. She lost count of cases. Lost track of time. Lost sense of everything except the growing, impossible realization that she was standing in a room filled with more wealth than she had seen in her entire life. But it was not just money. As she explored further, the flashlight revealed other items. Gold coins in sealed containers, their surfaces gleaming even under artificial light. Small bars of precious metal, each one stamped with weight and purity marks. Jewelry, not ornate, but valuable. Pieces selected for intrinsic worth rather than aesthetic appeal. And in the back of the room, larger items wrapped in protective coverings. She unwrapped one carefully, revealing a painting. Oil on canvas. The signature in the corner meant nothing to her, but the style and quality suggested significance beyond decoration. Sarah sat down on the stone floor, her legs no longer capable of supporting her weight. This was not a modest savings. This was not a nest egg or emergency fund. This was a fortune, an actual fortune, hidden deliberately, protected carefully, and now, through a series of improbable events, accessible to her. She tried to calculate value and found her mind unable to process numbers of that magnitude. Hundreds of thousands at minimum, possibly millions. She had no framework for understanding wealth at that scale. The shock gave way to disbelief. This could not be real. Things like this did not happen. Not to people like her. Not to homeless single mothers who bid $8 on abandoned lighthouses because they had no other options. But the money remained solid in her hands. The gold remained heavy and real. The paintings remained wrapped and waiting. Reality insisted on being acknowledged, no matter how impossible it seemed. Sarah sat there for a long time, breathing slowly, trying to absorb what had changed. Everything had changed. Her children, sleeping upstairs in a cold room with too few blankets and too much fear, would not have to live like this anymore. She would not have to calculate whether they could afford food or shoes or basic safety. The weight that had pressed down on her for so long, the crushing certainty that she could not provide enough, could not protect them adequately, could not build toward any future beyond survival. That weight lifted. She began to cry. Not with joy. Not yet. The emotion was too complicated for joy. Relief, yes. Shock. Fear that this might somehow be taken away or proven false. Grief for the months of suffering that might have been avoided if only she had found this sooner. Anger at systems that had let her fall so far when safety had been here all along, hidden but waiting. And underneath everything, a fragile, trembling hope that maybe, possibly, their lives could be different now. She pulled herself together slowly. The crying helped, releasing pressure that had built up over months of holding everything in. When she felt steady enough to stand, she began the work of understanding what exactly she had found. She examined the documents more carefully, spreading them on the floor in a flashlight's beam. Property deeds for land parcels she did not recognize. Stock certificates from companies she had heard of, names that appeared regularly in financial news. Bonds, their maturity dates long past. Their values likely increased with time and interest. Bank account information, though whether those accounts still existed was unclear. There was also a letter, sealed in plastic, addressed to whoever finds this. Sarah opened it with hands that shook. The handwriting was the same she had seen in the Lighthouse logs. Precise. Controlled. The letter was brief and direct. The writer explained that he had been a lighthouse keeper, then a keeper of his own accumulated wealth. He had no children. His extended family had proven themselves interested only in inheritance, not in relationship. He had decided that his resources should go to someone who valued effort over entitlement. If you are reading this, the letter concluded, you have demonstrated patience, resourcefulness, and determination. The contents of this room are yours. Use them well. Sarah read the letter 3 times. The validation in those words, the explicit permission to claim what she had found, settled something in her chest. This was not theft. This was not accidental. This was a deliberate transfer of wealth from someone who had chosen, decades ago, to let the future decide who deserved what he had built. And now, through a combination of desperation and persistence, Sarah had become that person. She made several trips to carry a small portion of the money upstairs, moving slowly, stopping frequently to verify that the children still slept. She hid it carefully in multiple locations, paranoid despite the isolation. She did not touch the gold or jewelry or paintings yet. Those were resources for later, after she had time to understand their value and determine how to convert them to usability. The money was immediate. The money could be used tomorrow. Dawn was approaching by the time she sealed the vault again and climbed into her own makeshift bed. Exhaustion pressed down, but sleep remained elusive. Her mind would not stop moving, racing through possibilities and plans and the sheer overwhelming reality of what had shifted in a single night. Tomorrow, everything would be different. Tomorrow, she would have to decide what came next. But tonight, in the last hours before the children woke, she allowed herself to feel something she had not felt in so long she had almost forgotten its texture. Security. Not complete, not guaranteed, but more solid than anything she had experienced in years. When morning came, Sarah woke with a clarity that surprised her. She had expected to feel different, transformed by what she had discovered. But the children still needed breakfast. The fire still needed tending. Survival still required the same actions it had required yesterday. The difference was that now, those actions had a foundation beneath them. Now, they were temporary rather than permanent. Now, she could begin to think about moving from survival to recovery. She told the children nothing. Not yet. They were too young to keep such a secret, and she needed time to understand the legal implications of what she had found before anyone else knew it existed. Instead, she focused on immediate improvements. That afternoon, she walked back to town, this time with money folded securely in her pocket. Real money. Enough to buy what they actually needed rather than what they could barely afford. She purchased a propane heater and fuel, proper cooking equipment, warm clothes for the children in sizes that actually fit, food that included fresh items, not just shelf-stable cans. The clerk's curiosity was more obvious now, but Sarah deflected questions with vague references to family money and fresh starts. Let him speculate. The truth was too improbable to guess and too valuable to share. She arranged for delivery of the larger items, giving the Lighthouse address without explanation. The clerk said it would take a few days to coordinate. Sarah said that was fine. They would be there. Walking back felt different. The road was just as rough, the distance just as far, but the weight in her pack was different. These were not desperate purchases rationed from the last of her resources. These were choices made freely, items selected for quality rather than minimum acceptability. The shift was subtle but significant. It felt like breathing after being underwater too long. When she returned, Emma noticed immediately. "Mama, your face looks different." Sarah crouched down. "Different how, sweetheart?" Emma studied her seriously. Not as worried. Sarah pulled her daughter close. "You're very observant." She did not explain further. Soon. She would explain soon. But not yet. First, she needed to solidify their situation, make sure the foundation was real and lasting. Over the next week, Sarah began the careful process of transformation. She used small amounts of the money to make the keeper's house genuinely livable. She hired a local handyman to repair the roof and replace broken windows, paying him cash and deflecting his questions about where someone living in an abandoned lighthouse had gotten money for renovations. She bought insulation and installed it herself in rooms where she could manage the work. She purchased a portable generator and fuel to run it, giving them electricity for the first time. The children adapted with the resilience of young people who had learned not to question improvements. They were warmer. They had better food. Their mother smiled more often. That was enough for now. But Sarah knew she could not delay explanations indefinitely. Soon, they would need to make larger decisions about whether to stay at the lighthouse or use the money to establish themselves elsewhere, about how to handle the valuables that still waited in the vault below, about what kind of future they wanted to build with resources they had never imagined possessing. She spent evenings after the children slept returning to the vault, cataloging its contents with increasing precision. She photographed items carefully using a phone she had purchased with a long-term data plan. She researched values online when signal allowed, feeling her breath catch as she discovered what some of the paintings and gold items might bring at auction. Conservative estimates put the total value well above $10 million. Optimistic estimates approached $50 million. The number was so large it lost meaning. She could not conceptualize that much wealth. She could only understand that their lives had changed in ways she was still learning to comprehend. On the 15th day since discovering the vault, Sarah made a decision. She would contact a lawyer, not locally but in the city, someone who specialized in estates and inheritance, someone who could help her understand the legal status of what she had found and how to claim it properly without triggering investigations or questions she could not answer. The keeper's letter gave her explicit permission, but she needed professional guidance to navigate the complexity of sudden wealth discovered in unusual circumstances. She spent a day researching lawyers, reading reviews, checking credentials. She selected one whose practice emphasized discretion and complex estate matters. She called from the phone she had purchased, speaking carefully, explaining only what was necessary. She had found assets in a property she had purchased legally. She needed guidance on proper procedure for claiming and transferring them. The lawyer asked pointed questions. Sarah answered honestly, but minimally. An appointment was scheduled. Terms were discussed. Sarah agreed to the hourly rate without negotiation, aware that professional guidance was worth far more than she would pay for it. The night before her trip to meet the lawyer, Sarah gathered the children and told them as much as they needed to know. She had found something valuable in the lighthouse, things left behind by the previous owner. It meant they would not have to worry about money anymore. They could stay here if they wanted, or they could move somewhere else. They could make choices now rather than having choices made for them by circumstance. Emma asked if they could have a real bed. Marcus asked if they could get a dog. David asked if this meant they were rich. Sarah answered yes to the first two questions and said the third question was complicated, which was the truest answer she could give. The children processed the information with a mixture of excitement and confusion. They had lived with scarcity for so long that abundance felt suspicious, something that might be taken away at any moment. Sarah understood that feeling intimately. She also understood that protecting them from that fear would take time and consistency. They would need to see that their situation had truly changed, not just temporarily improved. That would require patience. It would require careful choices. But for the first time in longer than she could remember, those choices existed to be made. The next morning, Sarah left before dawn, taking the earliest bus she could catch toward the city. The children stayed with a neighbor she had hired, a woman from a nearby town who ran a daycare and had agreed to watch them for the day. Sarah had vetted her carefully, visited her home, met her family, paid her more than the going rate. The children would be safe. She repeated that to herself as the bus carried her away from the lighthouse, away from the isolation that had protected them and trapped them in equal measure. The lawyer's office was everything Sarah expected. Expensive furniture, quiet efficiency, assistants who spoke in low voices and moved with practiced grace. She felt out of place in her thrift store clothes and worn shoes, but she kept her posture straight and her voice steady. She had purchased the Lighthouse legally. She had discovered its contents through legitimate exploration. She had documentation to prove both. That would have to be enough. The lawyer, a woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a measured manner, listened without interruption as Sarah explained. She had brought photographs. She had brought the keeper's letter. She had brought her deed and the auction paperwork. She laid it all out systematically, letting the evidence speak. When she finished, the lawyer sat back and studied her for a long moment. "This is unusual," she said finally, "but not unprecedented. And the letter helps significantly. It establishes intent and permission." She explained that the contents of the vault were technically part of the property Sarah had purchased, which meant they belonged to her legally. However, converting those assets to usable form would require careful procedure. Some items would need authentication. Others would need proper registration and tax documentation. The process would take time, but it was manageable. Sarah felt tension she had not realized she was holding begin to release. This was real. This was legal. This was not something that would be taken away. The lawyer outlined next steps: appraisals, authentication, establishment of proper accounts for managing large assets, introduction to financial advisors who specialized in sudden wealth. The list was long and detailed. Sarah took notes, asking questions when she did not understand, accepting recommendations when they were offered. By the time the meeting concluded 3 hours later, she had a clear path forward. It would not be quick. It would not be simple, but it was possible. Walking out of the office building, Sarah felt as though she had crossed another threshold. The vault had been the first. This meeting was the second. She was not just surviving anymore. She was building something. The exact shape of that something remained unclear, but for the first time in years, she had the resources to discover it. She could make mistakes now, without those mistakes destroying them. She could take time to figure out what she wanted, rather than just accepting what circumstances forced upon her. That freedom felt strange and precious and slightly terrifying all at once. The bus ride back to the lighthouse gave her time to think. She watched the landscape pass, processing everything the lawyer had told her, Everything that had changed since she bid $8 on a building everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the keeper who had built the vault, who had chosen to let fate rather than blood determine his legacy. She felt a strange gratitude toward this person she had never met, this stranger who had somehow, across decades, given her family a future. She would honor that gift. She would use it well, not lavishly, not recklessly, but well. That was all the letter had asked. That seemed like the least she owed in return. When she arrived back at the neighbor's house to collect the children, they rushed to her with questions and stories about their day. The neighbor smiled and said they had been wonderful. Sarah paid her, adding extra that the woman tried to refuse before accepting with quiet thanks. Small kindnesses, Sarah was learning, could be afforded now. Not as grand gestures, but as the kind of everyday generosity that made life easier for everyone involved. That evening at the Lighthouse, after the children were fed and playing quietly, Sarah allowed herself to truly examine the shift that had occurred. 2 weeks ago, they had been sleeping on shelter cots, counting days until forced departure. Now they lived in a lighthouse she owned outright, with heat and food and the beginning of real security. The transformation was so abrupt it felt surreal, like something that had happened to someone else, and she was merely observing from outside. She thought about the people at the auction, the whispers she had heard when she bid on the lighthouse. The homeless woman with her kids in tow. The judgment in those whispers had stung, but it had also fueled her determination. She wondered what those people would think if they knew what she had found. Probably that she had been lucky. And she had been. Desperately, improbably lucky. But luck alone had not opened that vault. Persistence had. Careful observation. Refusal to give up when giving up would have been easier. Luck had put her in position. Everything else had been choice. The lawyer had explained that full liquidation and transfer of assets would take months, possibly longer. Authentication of artwork required specialists. Gold and precious metals had to be assayed and documented. Stock certificates from decades past needed research to determine current value or whether the company still existed. The process was complex and would require patience. But even with delays, even with complications, Sarah now had access to resources that changed everything. She had withdrawn enough cash from the vault to handle immediate needs for the foreseeable future. The rest could wait for proper procedure. Over the following weeks, a routine emerged that felt almost normal. The children attended school in town, a small elementary, where the principal had been surprisingly accommodating when Sarah explained their situation in vague terms about fresh starts and family property. She drove them daily in a used but reliable car she had purchased with cash, a practical sedan that drew no attention and required no explanation. The days developed structure, morning routines, school drop-offs, time spent at the lighthouse making incremental improvements while waiting for larger transformations to unfold. Afternoon pickups, homework and dinner, evenings together, bedtimes that came easier now that fear had begun to recede. Sarah used the waiting period to educate herself. She read everything she could find about wealth management, about sudden inheritance, about the mistakes people made when they came into money unexpectedly. She learned about trusts and tax implications and investment strategies. She approached it the same way she approached everything else, with methodical attention to detail and awareness that ignorance carried consequences. The lawyer had recommended a financial advisor whose specialty was protecting inheritances and building sustainable wealth structures. Sarah met with her twice, asking questions, taking notes, slowly building understanding of concepts that had never been relevant to her life before. The advisor, a man in his 40s who spoke in clear, unpretentious language, impressed Sarah with his focus on sustainability rather than growth for growth's sake. He asked about her goals. Sarah had to think about that. She had spent so long focused on immediate survival that long-term goals felt like luxury she had not earned the right to consider. But pressed, she articulated what mattered. Security for her children. Education without debt. A home that was truly theirs. Beyond that, she wanted to use some portion of the money to help others who were where she had been. Not as grand charity, but as practical assistance given to people who were trying but falling short through no fault of their own. The advisor listened and nodded, treating her goals as reasonable rather than naive. He outlined strategies for creating reliable income without depleting principal. He explained how trusts could protect assets for the children's futures. He discussed tax-efficient giving and the structures that would let her help others in ways that were sustainable. By the end of their second meeting, Sarah had a framework that felt solid. Not flashy, not aggressive, but sound. That was what she needed. Soundness, stability, the chance to build something that would not crumble under pressure. As autumn deepened into winter, changes at the lighthouse became more visible. Professional contractors completed major structural repairs. The roof was fully sealed. Windows were replaced with modern, insulated units that kept heat in and wind out. The electrical system was upgraded to handle real demands rather than just minimal lighting. Running water was installed, connected to a new well drilled specifically for the property. The children had a bathroom now. Hot showers. The luxury of it brought Sarah to tears the first time Emma stood under warm water and laughed with pure joy. The keeper's house transformed from abandoned structure to actual home. Walls were repaired and painted. Floors were refinished. Furniture was purchased, not expensive pieces, but comfortable ones chosen for durability. Each room took shape slowly, reflecting function over style. Sarah was not trying to create a showplace. She was creating a space where her children could grow and thrive without fear that everything might be taken away at any moment. That required different priorities than aesthetics. The children adapted to their new circumstances with a resilience that amazed Sarah. Emma's anxiety decreased noticeably. She smiled more. She played without the constant looking over her shoulder that had characterized her behavior in the shelter. Marcus and David regained the kind of energy that came naturally to boys their age, energy that had been suppressed by stress and uncertainty. They explored the lighthouse grounds, created games, invented adventures that involved climbing rocks and building forts from driftwood. They fought and made up and acted like normal children rather than small adults carrying burdens they should never have had to shoulder. School provided structure and normalcy. The teachers noticed the change in the children's demeanor. Emma's teacher mentioned that she seemed more engaged, more willing to take risks in learning. The boys' teacher commented on improved focus and decreased anxiety-driven behaviors. Sarah attended parent-teacher conferences with a sense of participation she had not felt before. She could advocate now. She could be present. She was not juggling impossible schedules or missing meetings because she could not afford transportation. She was simply there, which felt like another small miracle in a series of them. But underneath the improvements and the growing stability, Sarah carried a secret that sometimes felt like a weight. The vault still held millions of dollars in assets, not yet liquidated. The authentication process crawled forward with frustrating slowness. Some paintings have been identified as works by recognized artists, their values confirmed by experts who asked no questions about provenance beyond what the documentation provided. Stock certificates have been traced to modern equivalents, some worth far more than their face value due to decades of splits and growth. The gold had been assayed and certified. Each confirmation added to the total, pushing the number higher than Sarah's most optimistic estimates. She told no one beyond her lawyer and financial advisor. Not neighbors, not teachers, certainly not the children, who knew only that Mama had found something valuable and they did not have to worry anymore. The secret created isolation of a different kind. She could not talk about her fears that the money might be somehow taken away. She could not discuss the guilt she felt at her good fortune when so many others remained trapped in circumstances she had escaped. She could not share the strange grief that came with realizing she had suffered unnecessarily for so long when safety had been waiting beneath her feet, hidden but present. On a cold December evening, 3 months after discovering the vault, Sarah received a call from her lawyer. The final appraisals were complete. Authentication was finalized. The total value of the assets, conservatively estimated, was $298 million. The number was so large Sarah had to ask the lawyer to repeat it twice to confirm she had heard correctly. $298 million. Nearly $300 million. The lawyer explained the breakdown calmly, professionally, as though such sums were routine. The paintings accounted for the majority. 3 pieces have been identified as works by artists whose names Sarah recognized, even with her limited knowledge. Old masters whose works rarely came to market. The rest was distributed among gold, bonds, and stocks that had appreciated dramatically over decades of untouched growth. Sarah ended the call and sat in the kitchen she had renovated, staring at nothing. She had known the amount would be large, but knowing abstractly and hearing the specific number were different experiences. This was not wealth that would make life comfortable. This was wealth that would transform not just her family, but generations to come. This was the kind of money that came with responsibility she had never imagined bearing. How did someone who had been homeless 3 months ago manage $300 million? What did one do with that level of resources? The answer came slowly, but with clarity. She would do what she had always done. She would approach it carefully, methodically, with attention to detail and awareness of consequences. She would not pretend to be someone she was not. She would not try to become a person who belonged in circles where that kind of wealth was normal. She would remain herself, using resources to build security and help others, living quietly and without flash. That was within her capacity. Anything else would be performance rather than authenticity. That night, after the children were asleep, Sarah descended to the vault one final time before it would be fully emptied for proper management. She stood in the space that had changed everything, running her hand along stone walls, feeling the weight of what had happened here. She thought about the keeper who had built this, who had accumulated wealth through means she still did not fully understand, and then chosen to hide it rather than pass it through traditional channels. She wondered what he would think of her, whether she was the kind of person he had imagined might find his legacy. The letter had said she had demonstrated patience, resourcefulness, and determination. Sarah hoped that was true. She hoped she could prove worthy of the trust placed in her by a stranger across decades. She would try. That was all anyone could do. Try to make good choices. Try to use resources well. Try to be better than. Circumstances required. The keeper had bet on whoever found his vault. Sarah would not let that bet fail. Climbing back up to the main house, she felt something settle in her chest. Not quite peace. The transformation was too recent, too overwhelming for peace. But maybe acceptance. Acceptance that this had happened. That her life had changed irrevocably. That she would need to grow into this new reality rather than trying to shrink it to fit her old understanding. She could do that. She had done harder things with far less support. December turned to January. The lighthouse stood solid against winter storms, its walls thick and unyielding. Inside, warmth held constant. The children grew. Emma's shoes fit properly now. Marcus and David had coats that were new rather than handed down. Small changes that represented massive shifts. Sarah watched them play and learn and slowly release the fear that had marked their shelter days. She watched them become children again and felt grateful in ways that defied articulation. The financial structures took shape according to the advisor's recommendations. Trusts were established for each child's future. Investment accounts were funded with conservative allocations designed for long-term stability. A foundation was created to handle charitable giving in structured ways that would maximize impact. Sarah insisted on maintaining significant liquid reserves, her instinct toward security too deeply ingrained to fully overcome. The advisor did not argue. He understood, he said, that sudden wealth required time to feel real. Holding substantial cash reserves was not the most efficient strategy, but it was psychologically necessary. Sarah appreciated that he recognized the difference. As word of the major renovations spread through the small coastal community, questions came. Sarah deflected them carefully. She explained that she had found valuable items left by the previous owner, that she had sold them, that she was investing in making the lighthouse livable. It was not the full truth, but it was true enough. People accepted it with the kind of polite disinterest that came naturally to communities that valued privacy. Some expressed curiosity. A few expressed skepticism. None pushed hard enough to become problems. In February, Sarah made a decision that felt simultaneously necessary and terrifying. She would tell the children the truth. Not all of it. They were too young for details about asset values and legal structures. But they deserved to know that their lives had changed permanently, that the security they felt was real and lasting, that they could make plans for futures without fearing those plans would be destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. She chose a quiet evening after dinner, gathering them in the living room where the fire burned steadily. She explained simply. The things Mama had found in the lighthouse were very valuable. More valuable than she had first realized. It meant they would always have enough money for what they needed. It meant they could make choices about where to live and what to do. It meant their futures were secure in ways that had not been true before. Emma asked if that meant they were rich. Sarah paused, then nodded. Yes, sweetheart. By most standards, yes. David asked if they were millionaires. Sarah took a breath. Yes, many times over. The children processed this with wide eyes and excited whispers. Marcus wanted to know if they could buy a boat. Sarah laughed, a sound that felt good in her chest. Maybe someday, if that's something you really want. She made them promise not to tell anyone at school. Not because it was a secret exactly, but because that kind of information changed how people treated you. She wanted them to have normal childhoods, normal friendships, normal experiences of growing up without the complication of everyone knowing their family had suddenly come into extraordinary wealth. The children agreed solemnly. Sarah was not sure how long they would maintain that agreement, but she hoped their awareness of its importance would help. The weeks following that conversation brought subtle shifts. The children carried themselves slightly differently, their posture reflecting reduced anxiety. They asked questions about the future more readily, wondering about places they might travel or things they might learn. Sarah answered honestly, balancing possibility with practicality. Yes, they could travel, but education came first. Yes, they could pursue interests that required resources, but within reason, with understanding that money enabled opportunities but did not replace effort or discipline. In March, Sarah received confirmation that the final assets had been liquidated and properly allocated according to the structures her advisor had designed. The vault below was empty now, its purpose served. She had kept only the keeper's letter, framed simply and hung in her bedroom where she could see it daily. The reminder of where they had come from and the responsibility that came with where they were now felt important to maintain. She never wanted to lose sight of the fact that wealth was not earned through her own efforts, but given by circumstance and a stranger's choice. That awareness needed to be present in every decision she made about how to use what she had been given. Spring brought warmth and longer days. The lighthouse grounds came alive with growing things. Sarah planted a garden in the area where the old greenhouse had stood, working the soil with her own hands, teaching the children how seeds became food. It was not necessary anymore. They could afford any food they wanted. But the act of growing things felt important, a connection to the reality that survival required work regardless of wealth. The children enjoyed it, getting dirt under their nails and watching tiny plants push through soil. Emma named her tomato plants. The boys competed over whose beans grew fastest. It was normal and good and exactly what Sarah wanted for them. In April, a reporter called. Someone had apparently noticed the transformation of the lighthouse property and put together pieces about the auction and the renovation and suspected there was a story. Sarah declined to comment. The reporter persisted, calling twice more. Sarah remained firm. Their lives were private. The lighthouse's history was private. She had no interest in publicity. When a photographer appeared at the edge of the property, clearly hoping for images, Sarah called the lawyer. The lawyer sent a letter. The reporter and photographer did not return. Sarah understood that interest would likely persist, that eventually something might leak or be discovered. But she would protect their privacy as long as possible. The foundation she had established began its work quietly. Small grants to organizations that helped homeless families. Funding for programs that provided immediate assistance without bureaucratic delays. Support for educational initiatives that helped children in under-resourced schools. Sarah insisted on anonymity for all of it. The money came from the foundation, which had a name that revealed nothing about its source. She visited some of the programs in person, not as a donor, but as someone interested in their work. She saw the impact of resources properly applied. She saw families receive help at critical moments. She saw children gain opportunities they would not have had otherwise. It felt right in ways that spending money on herself never quite did. By summer, the lighthouse felt fully transformed. It was no longer an abandoned structure on a remote point of coastline. It was a home. Sarah stood on the gallery at the top of the tower one evening, watching the sun set over the ocean, and felt the full weight of what had changed. 6 months ago, she had climbed these stairs for the first time with 3 frightened children, all of them cold and hungry and desperate. Now those same children slept in warm beds below, their bellies full, their future secure. The transformation was complete in its major movements. What remained was the slower work of living into their new reality, of learning who they could become without the constant pressure of survival. She thought about the moment at the auction when she had raised her hand to bid. How foolish it had seemed to others. How desperate it had felt to her. How impossible it had been to imagine that $8 could purchase not just a building, but a complete transformation of circumstance. She had gambled everything on a hope she barely believed in. And somehow, improbably, impossibly, that gamble had paid off beyond anything she could have dreamed. The ocean moved below, constant and indifferent. The lighthouse stood solid, its walls thick with history and purpose. And inside, 3 children grew toward futures that were no longer constrained by their mother's fears. Sarah watched the last light fade from the sky and felt something close to gratitude. Not for what she had found, though that mattered, but for what she had chosen to do with it. For the decision to use wealth as a tool rather than an identity. For the commitment to remain herself rather than trying to become someone else. For the quiet determination to honor a stranger's trust by being worthy of it. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Managing wealth was complex. Protecting children from its corrupting influences required vigilance. Building a life that felt meaningful rather than simply comfortable took work. But those were problems she could face. Those were challenges she could meet. The impossible part was behind them. What remained was simply living, which suddenly seemed like a gift rather than a burden. The first sign that their story was no longer entirely private came in June, almost 7 months after Sarah had discovered the vault. At the grocery store, she overheard 2 women talking. I heard it was paintings, really old, valuable ones. The lighthouse lady? Wasn't she the one at the auction with the kids? That's what makes it so crazy. 1 minute barely scraping by, next minute renovating that whole property. Sarah finished her shopping quickly, unsettled by her life becoming gossip. That evening, she called her lawyer. The lawyer was pragmatic. Rumors would spread regardless. Sarah chose privacy. Her life was not public property just because circumstances had changed. Over following weeks, Sarah noticed shifts in how people treated her. Bank tellers smiled warmly. Clerks offered discounts. Parents suddenly wanted playdates. Some attention felt genuine. Much felt opportunistic. Sarah navigated carefully, accepting genuine overtures and deflecting opportunistic ones. The children noticed too. Marcus mentioned kids at school were suddenly interested in being his friend. Emma reported that a girl who had previously ignored her now wanted to sit together at lunch. Sarah explained that sometimes people's interest was genuine and sometimes not, and learning to tell the difference was important. She taught them to observe patterns. In July, the county held another property auction. Sarah attended, thinking perhaps she could help someone else. During a break, she felt a tap on her shoulder. She turned to find the woman who had been sitting in front of her at the previous auction, one who had whispered about the homeless woman with her kids. "You're the lighthouse lady," she said. Sarah nodded. "I am. That was quite a find." The woman paused. "I almost bid on that property myself. Decided it wasn't worth the trouble." Sarah could have been gracious. Instead, she said something more honest. "The trouble was considerable. I spent weeks making it barely livable. But sometimes the things everyone else dismisses are exactly where possibility hides." The woman nodded stiffly and walked away. Vindication felt less gratifying than imagined. She thought about all the people who had judged her, caseworkers with impatience, shelter neighbors whispering about bad choices, auction attendees dismissing her bid. None had been cruel, just certain they understood her situation better than she did. In August, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. A woman in her 60s introduced herself as Margaret Shunn, a distant relative of the lighthouse keeper. Sarah's stomach tightened, but Margaret raised a hand. "I'm not here to dispute anything. I knew my uncle's wishes. I just wanted to meet the person who found what he left behind." Sarah invited her in. The keeper, Harold Shunn, had been Margaret's mother's brother. He had been estranged from family for decades. He always said his money would go to someone who earned it, Margaret said. He didn't believe in inherited wealth. Said it corrupted people. He'd been burned by relatives who only saw him as money. Sarah understood Harold's perspective. She had seen entitlement up close. "I'm glad it was you," Margaret said. "You needed it, and you're using it well." That's all he wanted. They talked for over an hour. Margaret shared stories about Harold. Brilliant and difficult, successful through careful investments, but profoundly lonely. Sarah felt unexpected kinship with a man she had never met. When Margaret left, she shook Sarah's hand. "Use it well. That's all any of us can do." Sarah felt as though she had been given permission she had not known she needed. September brought new challenges. The foundation was operating smoothly, but Sarah wanted to do more. After weeks of consideration, she created a program specifically for families facing homelessness. The Second Chance Initiative would provide immediate assistance, emergency housing, job training, and long-term support. The program launched quietly. It offered families what Sarah had needed, but could not access. Fast decisions, flexible criteria. The response was overwhelming. By October, 37 families were in stable housing with support systems in place. The children's lives normalized. Emma joined dance class. Marcus discovered a passion for building. David became obsessed with marine biology. Sarah was relieved to see them developing interests beyond survival. They were becoming people. In November, Sarah decided to write about their experience. She wrote in evenings after the children slept, organizing thoughts that had churned since the auction. The shame of homelessness, the shelter, the auction, the lighthouse, the discovery. What came after? The writing became therapy. She had no idea what she would do with the pages accumulating in her notebook. For now, the writing itself was enough. December arrived with storms. Sarah stood on the gallery watching waves crash below. The children were inside, warm and safe. She thought about the previous December at the shelter. 1 year. So much had changed. She thought about the people who had judged her at the auction. Their judgment had been rooted in comfortable narratives. Poor people made bad choices. Homeless people lacked discipline. Sarah's story contradicted that. She had made good choices and still ended up homeless. The truth was uncomfortable. Safety was more fragile than most wanted to believe. The storm passed. Sarah joined her children on the couch. This was home. This was safety. This was everything she had fought for. In January, 1 year after buying the lighthouse, Sarah hosted a gathering. Margaret Shunn, the lawyer, the financial advisor, the handyman, families from the Second Chance Initiative, the neighbor who had watched the children, people who had been part of the journey. They gathered in the now-renovated lighthouse. Sarah prepared food with the children's help. She did not make speeches. She just wanted these people together. The lawyer mentioned Sarah's situation was one of the most unusual she had encountered, not because of the money, but because Sarah had handled it with more wisdom than most. The financial advisor agreed. Margaret shared Harold's stories. The families talked about their progress. It was communion of sorts. After everyone left, after the children were in bed, Sarah sat alone in the kitchen and thought about the year. She had started it homeless and desperate. She had ended it secure and positioned to help others. The transformation was complete in its major movements. But she understood now that transformation was not a destination. It was an ongoing process, a series of choices made daily about who to be and how to live. Wealth had removed immediate pressures, but it had not answered fundamental questions about meaning and purpose. Though she still had to work out on her own, she thought about the future. The children would grow. Their needs would change. They would face challenges that money could ease but not eliminate. She would need to guide them through privilege they had not earned, help them understand both their good fortune and their responsibility. That would require constant attention and wisdom she was not sure she possessed. But she would try. She would do her best. That was all anyone could do. She thought about the Second Chance initiative, about expanding it, about finding ways to help more people. She thought about whether to ever share her story publicly, whether it might do more good than harm. She thought about the Lighthouse, about whether they would stay here long-term or eventually move somewhere less isolated. So many decisions still to make. So many paths still branching before them. But for the first time in years, she approached those decisions from a position of strength rather than desperation. That changed everything. In February, Sarah received a call from a journalist who had been persistent despite her previous refusals. He explained that he wanted to write about sudden inheritance, about how people handled unexpected wealth, about the psychology and challenges involved. He had heard her story through various sources and wanted to include it as a case study. He promised complete anonymity if that was what she required. Sarah's first instinct was to refuse again, but something made her pause. She thought about the families still sleeping in shelters, still facing 30-day deadlines with nowhere to go afterward. She thought about the judgment they faced, the assumptions people made about their worthiness. If her story could challenge those assumptions, even slightly, maybe it was worth the exposure. She told the journalist she would consider it and call back. She spent a week thinking, consulting her lawyer and advisor, weighing risks and potential benefits. Finally, she agreed with conditions. Complete anonymity for her and the children. No photos. No identifying details beyond the basic outline of what had happened. The journalist accepted her terms. The interview took place over several sessions, Sarah answering questions carefully, trying to convey the complexity of her experience without reducing it to simple narrative. She talked about homelessness, about the shelter, about fear and desperation and the small choices that kept them going. She talked about the auction, the lighthouse, the discovery. She talked about what came after, the difficulty of sudden wealth, the isolation it created, the responsibility it demanded. The journalist listened attentively, asking follow-up questions that suggested genuine interest rather than just hunting for sensational details. When the article appeared 2 months later, Sarah barely recognized her own story in its telling. It was accurate in facts, but somehow missed the texture of experience. The fear felt sanitized. The relief felt dramatized. The transformation felt neater than it had been in reality. But the core message was there. Poverty was not moral failure. Homelessness was not permanent identity. Circumstances could change, and when they did, what mattered was what people chose to do with that change. Response to the article was mixed. Some readers expressed inspiration. Others expressed skepticism. A few expressed anger that Sarah had been given wealth she had not earned while they continued to struggle. Sarah read some of the comments and then stopped. She could not control how people interpreted her story or what they took from it. She had shared it as honestly as she could, with the hope it might help someone. Whether it did or not was beyond her influence. She had done what she could. That had to be enough. She returned to her daily life, to the routine she had built, to the children who needed her presence more than they needed her to manage strangers' opinions about their circumstances. Spring came again, marking more than a year since the vault discovery. Sarah took stock of where they were. The children thrived. Emma was confident in ways she had not been before. Marcus had found community through his building projects. David's knowledge of marine life had become genuinely impressive. They still remembered the shelter, still carried awareness of how quickly things could change. But fear no longer defined them. They were growing into themselves, becoming people rather than just surviving circumstances. The foundation continued its work. The Second Chance initiative had helped over 200 families by this point. Sarah had hired staff to manage it, freeing herself from day-to-day operations while maintaining oversight of direction and values. She visited programs periodically, listening to success stories and challenges, learning what worked and what needed adjustment. It was not perfect. Nothing was perfect. but it was making a difference in ways she could measure and verify. She had made decisions about the lighthouse, too. They would stay, at least for now. The isolation that had once felt dangerous now felt protective. The children had space to grow without constant public scrutiny. She had privacy to figure out who she wanted to be beyond just someone who had gotten lucky. The lighthouse had saved them. It seemed right to honor that by making it truly home rather than just a way station on a path to somewhere else. In May, Sarah organized a small memorial for Harold Chun. Not a funeral. He had been dead for years. But an acknowledgement of what he had done, the choice he had made, the legacy he had created. Margaret came. A few others who had known Harold attended. They gathered at the lighthouse, where Sarah had planted a garden that was now flourishing with spring growth. She read Harold's letter aloud, the words taking on deeper meaning now that she had lived into the responsibility they described. To whoever finds this, you have demonstrated patience, resourcefulness, and determination. The contents of this room are yours. Use them well. She had tried to use them well. She believed Harold would approve of what she had built with his gift. Not lavish displays of wealth, not conspicuous consumption, but security for her family and meaningful help for others facing the circumstances she had escaped. That felt right. That felt like honoring trust rather than squandering opportunity. After the memorial, Margaret stayed for tea. She looked around the lighthouse, taking in the renovations, the signs of life and stability. He would have liked knowing it was you, she said finally. He always believed people revealed their character through how they handled resources. You've revealed yours well. The compliment meant more than Sarah could easily express. She thanked Margaret quietly, and they sat together in comfortable silence. Two women connected by a man neither had known well, but both had been shaped by in unexpected ways. When Margaret left, Sarah stood on the gallery and watched the car disappear down the coastal road. She felt a sense of completion she had not felt before. The story had proper ending now, or at least a resting point before whatever came next. Summer brought visitors of a different sort. The children's friends, increasingly comfortable at the lighthouse, started spending more time there. Emma hosted sleepovers. Marcus invited his building club for a day of projects. David organized a beach exploration trip for his classmates. Sarah watched her children share their home with casual generosity and felt pride that went beyond their circumstances. They were learning to hold wealth lightly, to see it as tool rather than identity. That was the most important thing she could teach them. That was the legacy she wanted to leave beyond just money and trust accounts. In August, Sarah finished writing her account of their journey. The notebook had grown to several hundred pages, more than she had intended, but apparently necessary to capture the full scope of transformation. She read through it once, then put it away. Maybe someday she would share more widely. Maybe it would help someone understand that circumstances were not character, that poverty was not moral failing, that hope was not always foolish even when it felt desperate. But that was future concern. For now, having written it was enough. She thought about the moment at the auction when she had raised her hand. $8. That was all it had cost to change everything. $8 and the willingness to try something that everyone else had dismissed as worthless. She thought about the mockery she had felt then, the judgment in those whispers. She thought about vindication, about whether proving those people wrong had brought satisfaction. It had not, really. Their judgment had never been the point. Their approval or disapproval did not change what she had done or what it had meant. The only validation that mattered was her own understanding that she had made the right choice at the right time for the right reasons. In October, 2 years after discovering the vault, Sarah made a decision that felt both frightening and necessary. She would tell the full story publicly, not for fame or recognition, but because she believed it needed to be told, that it contained lessons about poverty and judgment and the arbitrary nature of fortune that people needed to hear. She contacted a writer she trusted, someone who specialized in narrative nonfiction, and proposed collaboration. They would write a book together. Sarah's story, told honestly and completely, with all the complexity and contradiction intact. It would take time, possibly years. But it would exist. It would be permanent record of what had happened and what it had meant. The work began slowly. Interviews, research, fact-checking. The writer approached it with sensitivity that Sarah appreciated. This was not sensationalism. This was careful exploration of how systems failed people and how rare opportunities sometimes appeared in the gaps between failure and complete collapse. It was about how Sarah had recognized that opportunity when it appeared and what she had chosen to do with it afterward. The writing process was difficult, requiring Sarah to revisit memories she had been content to leave in the past. But it was also healing in ways she had not anticipated, telling the story completely, with witness who treated it as significant rather than just dramatic, validated experiences she had sometimes doubted were real. By the second anniversary of buying the Lighthouse, Sarah had settled into a life that felt sustainable. The foundation operated smoothly. The children thrived in school and activities. The Lighthouse stood solid against another winter's storms. She had learned to manage wealth without being defined by it, to use resources without losing sense of who she had been before they became available. That balance felt precious and fragile, something that required constant attention but had become manageable with practice. She thought often about the family still in shelters, still facing deadlines and impossible choices. She knew her help reached only a fraction of those who needed it. She knew the Second Chance initiative, however successful, was drop in ocean of need. But she also knew that drops accumulated, that individual acts of assistance compounded over time, that she could not solve systemic problems alone, but could contribute to solutions in ways that honored both the gift she had been given and the experience that had prepared her to use it well. On a quiet evening in late December, Sarah descended to the vault one final time before it would be permanently sealed. She had decided to close it to prevent future curiosity or exploration. The space had served its purpose. Now it could rest. She stood in the empty room, remembering the shock of first discovery, the overwhelming relief, the fear that it might somehow be taken away. None of those emotions remained. In their place was quiet gratitude and steady determination to remain worthy of the trust Harold Chun had placed in whoever found his legacy. She climbed back up and sealed the entrance, the stone door fitting perfectly into place. The seam was invisible now. The numbered plate remained, but without context it meant nothing. The passage would be forgotten eventually, become part of the Lighthouse's history rather than accessible present. That felt right. Some stories were meant to be told. Others were meant to be sealed away, their impact measured in outcomes rather than revelation. As she returned to the main house where her children waited, where warmth and light and safety filled spaces that had once been cold and dark and threatening, Sarah felt the full weight of transformation settle comfortably on her shoulders. They had come so far. They had survived and then thrived. They had been given an extraordinary gift and had used it to build lives that felt meaningful beyond just material comfort. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. The Lighthouse stood against the winter dark, its windows glowing warmly, its walls holding firm. Inside, 3 children grew toward futures no longer constrained by their mother's fears. And Sarah, who had once been homeless and desperate and dismissed as foolish for bidding on abandoned building, sat at her kitchen table and felt something she had not felt in years. Not just security, not just relief, but genuine, grounded hope that tomorrow would be better than today, and that she had the resources and resilience to help make it so. That was the true fortune, not the money in accounts or assets carefully managed, but the knowledge that they had endured and emerged stronger, that they had been tested and had proven themselves equal to challenges nobody should have to face. The Lighthouse had saved them, but they had saved themselves first through small acts of courage repeated daily until courage became ordinary and ordinary became extraordinary. And now, watching her children laugh together over a game they had invented, seeing their faces free from the fear that had marked them during shelter days, Sarah understood that the greatest transformation had been internal. Circumstances had changed, yes. But more importantly, she had changed. She had learned that she was capable of more than survival, that she could build as well as endure, that she possessed strength and wisdom that circumstances had forced her to discover. The money had made things easier, but the real work had been done before the vault opened, in the daily choice to keep moving forward when forward looked impossible. The ocean crashed against the rocks below, constant and unchanging. The lighthouse stood its ground, doing what it was built to do. And inside, Sarah Mitchell closed her notebook, turned off the light, and went to be with her children. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But tonight, they were warm and safe and together. After everything they had been through, that was miracle enough. In March, she ran into a caseworker from the shelter at a community meeting. The woman's eyes traveled over Sarah's appearance. "You look so different. What happened?" Sarah considered, then was direct. "I found stability. The kind your office couldn't provide despite my repeated requests." The words came out harder than intended. The caseworker flushed. "We have protocols, limited resources." "You didn't help me at all," Sarah said quietly. The caseworker made an excuse and walked away. Vindication felt less gratifying than imagined. In April, she attended a fundraising gala for a homeless services organization. She bought a table, uncomfortable in formal clothing. The room was full of people who spoke of helping the homeless without personal memory of what homelessness felt like. During the silent auction, she bid aggressively. People began asking who she was. One woman approached. "You're the Lighthouse woman, aren't you?" Sarah nodded. The woman asked for thoughts on program strategies, framing it as valuing lived experience. Sarah explained what the Second Chance Initiative did differently. The woman smiled politely, then mentioned accountability measures being important for stewarding donor funds. Sarah felt something snap. "I was homeless for 9 months. I filled out forms for every program your organization runs. I waited weeks for decisions that never came. Your systems prioritize covering liability over helping people. So when I say accountability measures can become barriers, I'm telling you what I experienced. You can dismiss that, but it's a perspective you'll never have." The woman excused herself quickly. One man approached afterward, a program director. "Thank you for saying that. We need to hear it." In May, Sarah received a letter from Jennifer, a family the initiative had helped 6 months earlier. Jennifer had been trapped in a shelter with 2 children, facing a deadline. The program had provided emergency housing, job training, and support. The letter detailed what happened since. Permanent work, children thriving, an affordable apartment. "You gave me more than money," Jennifer wrote. "You gave me dignity. You treated me like a person who was trying rather than a problem to be managed. That changed everything. I want you to know that I will never forget it, and that I plan to do the same for someone else when I'm in a position to help." Sarah read it 3 times, tears blurring the words. This was vindication that mattered. She used the letter as evidence for expanding the initiative. By summer, over 400 families had been helped. Academic researchers wanted to study the model. The research produced evidence that the approach was effective. Sarah became a reluctant advocate, speaking at conferences. She spoke plainly about how systems failed people. In September, she received an award. She gave a brief speech focusing on families served rather than herself. By October, 3 years after discovering the vault, Sarah had established a rhythm that felt sustainable. The foundation operated professionally with competent staff managing most operations. The Second Chance Initiative had expanded to 3 cities, with plans for more. The Lighthouse remained home base, a place of stability and privacy that grounded her when advocacy work became overwhelming. The children were thriving, growing into teenagers who understood both their privilege and their responsibility. They volunteered with the foundation, not out of obligation, but genuine interest. Emma worked with younger children at family shelters. Marcus helped with building and repair projects. David organized environmental education programs. They were becoming people Sarah was proud to know, not just because they were her children, but because they were genuinely good humans who used their advantages to help others. Sarah herself had changed in ways that went beyond circumstances. She was more confident, less apologetic about taking up space. She had learned to advocate without aggression, to push back without burning bridges, to persist despite resistance. The homeless woman who had stood at that auction, counting her last dollars and hoping for a miracle, felt like a different person. Not better or worse, just different. Changed by experience, hardened in some ways, but softened in others. Capable of things she had not imagined herself capable of 3 years earlier. The transformation was internal as much as external, measured in resilience and wisdom as much as bank balances and property deeds. In November, Sarah made a pilgrimage of sorts. She drove to the shelter where they had stayed, where the 30-day deadline had loomed like an ending. She had not been back since leaving, had avoided the area entirely. But something about the 3-year anniversary made her want to see it again, to close a circle that remained open. She parked across the street and sat in her car, watching people enter and exit. Some looked like she remembered feeling, exhausted, frightened, hanging on by threads. Others looked numb, past fear into acceptance. She recognized both states intimately. She thought about going in, maybe talking to someone, sharing her story, but she decided against it. Her story, while true, was also exceptional. Most people sleeping in that shelter would not find hidden fortunes. Most would struggle and fight and work desperately and still not escape. Her presence, her transformation might inspire a few, but it might also deepen despair for those who tried everything and failed anyway. Sometimes hope needed to be more practical than magical. Sometimes people needed to hear that incremental progress was valuable even when it did not lead to dramatic transformation. That was harder to communicate than a lighthouse story, but it was more universally applicable. She drove away without going inside, instead visiting the Second Chance Initiative's office in the city. She spent the afternoon talking with staff, reviewing cases, listening to success stories and challenges. One family had just moved into permanent housing. Another was struggling with employment instability. A third had asked for continued support beyond the program's normal timeline. Staff wanted Sarah's input on flexibility versus consistency, on when to bend rules and when to maintain structure. She offered thoughts drawn from her own experience, always returning to the principle that people generally knew what they needed and deserved trust until they proved otherwise. It was not a perfect principle. Sometimes trust was misplaced, but more often, she had found, assuming incompetence created dependence, while assuming capability created success. By evening, Sarah returned to the lighthouse, to her children and the home they had built together. As she climbed the spiral stairs to the gallery, a habit she had maintained since their first weeks here, she thought about the journey that had brought them to this point. The desperation, the auction, the $8 bid everyone else had dismissed, the cold, frightening first weeks, the discovery that changed everything, the year of adjustment and transformation. And now, 3 years in, the stable life they had built on foundations of luck and persistence in measures difficult to separate. She thought about Harold Chun, about his letter, about whether she had used his gift well. She believed she had. Not perfectly, but honestly, not without mistakes, but with genuine effort toward good outcomes. That was all the letter had asked. That felt like enough. She thought about the people who had judged her at the auction, wondered if any of them ever thought about the homeless woman who had bid on a worthless lighthouse. Probably not. People rarely remembered their casual dismissals. But Sarah remembered, not with bitterness, but with understanding that judgment was easy and empathy was hard, that people protected their own sense of security by believing poverty was something that happened to others for reasons that would not apply to them. Her story did not fit that comfortable narrative. It suggested that safety was more fragile than most people wanted to believe. That made it uncomfortable. But discomfort was not her responsibility to manage. She had lived the truth. Others could accept it or deny it as they chose. As December approached, Sarah prepared for the holidays with a sense of gratitude that felt earned rather than obligatory. They would celebrate at the Lighthouse, as they had for the past 2 years. They would invite Margaret Chun, who had become something like family. They would invite a few of the families from the Second Chance Initiative who had nowhere else to go. They would cook together, and eat together and be together in ways that acknowledged both how far they had come and how fragile any circumstance could be. It would not be extravagant. Sarah had no interest in extravagance, but it would be warm and welcoming and full of people who understood what it meant to be on the outside looking in, who had been given chances they had not expected and were determined to pass that gift forward. On Christmas Eve, as snow fell lightly outside and the lighthouse stood solid against winter cold, Sarah gathered everyone in the living room. She had something to share. The book she had been working on with the writer was nearly complete. It would be published the following year, her story told completely and honestly for anyone who wanted to read it. She had struggled with the decision, had worried about privacy and exposure. But ultimately, she believed the story needed to be told, that it contained lessons worth sharing even if sharing made her uncomfortable. The children reacted with mixed emotions. Emma worried about strangers knowing their business. Marcus thought it was cool. David wanted to know if they would be in it. Sarah explained that their privacy would be protected, that details would be changed, that the focus was on the journey rather than specific identities. They seemed to accept this, trusting her judgment even when they did not fully understand her reasoning. Margaret expressed pride that Harold's legacy would be documented, that his unconventional choice to let fate determine his heir would be vindicated by the outcome. The families from the Second Chance Initiative expressed hope that the book might help others understand what homelessness actually felt like, how it happened to people trying hard, how the difference between stability and crisis was often just a series of small failures compounding beyond control. Sarah listened to their responses and felt the decision solidify. Yes, the book should exist, not for her benefit, but for all the people whose stories remained untold because they had not found hidden fortunes to transform their circumstances. She could speak for some of them. Not all, but some. That was better than remaining silent. The evening progressed into celebration that was joyful without forgetting the struggles that had preceded it. They ate well and laughed easily and were present with each other in ways that felt like the greatest luxury of all. Later, after guests had left and children had gone to bed, Sarah stood on the gallery one final time, watching stars emerge as clouds cleared. She thought about where they had started and where they had ended up. The distance was measured in more than miles or dollars. It was measured in confidence regained, in fear released, in possibilities opened. The transformation was complete in its major movements. What remained was the daily work of living well, of honoring gifts received by giving generously, of using privilege to create opportunities for others. The ocean moved below, constant in its rhythm. The lighthouse stood solid, fulfilling the purpose for which it had been built, offering guidance to those who needed it. And inside, Sarah Mitchell felt something close to peace. Not the absence of challenge or worry, but the presence of foundation solid enough to weather what might come. They had survived the storm. They had found harbor, and now they worked to help others do the same. That was legacy worth building. That was story worth telling. That was life worth living, one day at a time, with gratitude and purpose in equal measure. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.